Now recording. Or yeah,
No
there we go.
Yep, so it's recording now, and I will publish this later for everybody else. But Maddie, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you for that lovely intro, Michelle. So so excited to be with everybody today. And I said it before, but for anybody who joined later, if you have a question at any point, please just unmute yourself and yell it out. It's not going to break my flow. But anyway, I'm Maddy Osman. I run the Blogsmith. So we create SEO content for B2B tech brands, mostly in the WordPress space. There's some outliers there. And so a lot of what I'm going to tell you is going to come from that experience, but the topic itself is pretty like topic or industry agnostic. But if there's anything that, you want to dig into, just let me know. But other than that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I was going to say as well, you can see my Twitter handle in the bottom right-hand corner. If you want to grab the slides for yourself, just go to my Twitter and I've pinned it to the top and you can grab them. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dig in here. So we're going to start with just kind of the basics of how to create a kick-ass blog post. Essentially, if you're going to be creating any sort of new content, there's already so much content that lives out there in the world. You want to create something that's genuinely useful, not just adding to the void. Mark Schaefer, I can't remember what he called it, but there's some sort of term that he coined about like content overload and measuring just the sheer amount of things that are published, like even in a second or a minute or an hour. And it's like insane. I mean, there are limited hours in the day for us all to even consume this content. So just kind of bringing the point home that whatever you make, it shouldn't just be for content's sake. It should be because you have something unique to add to what's already out there. So a couple of things that I use to define a piece of content that's worth creating. First of all, it has to be consistent. If you have a blog and you have certain ways that you write headings or certain ways that you show block quotes or certain ways that you format images, things like that, it's important to be consistent from blog post to blog post because consistency essentially breeds trust. If there's something off, sometimes it's not a conscious thought to know that it's off, but subconsciously the reader might be thinking like, oh, there's something wrong with this blog post if it's just something about it is inconsistent. So at the Blogsmith, we have our own style guide. It's based off of AP style, which is just news journalism writing. And so I would recommend to you, I think I say it later in this presentation too, but to start building your own style guide and use AP style as a baseline. And then if there's anything that you personally want to change from AP style, that's your opportunity to kind of add to your own style guide and define, what that formatting looks like for you. It's also things like having engaging visuals, because I think a lot of people think about content as just the written word, and that's a hugely important part of it, especially from an SEO perspective. That gives Google more context to dive into to understand the relation of your topic with a query that somebody types in. But engaging visuals, I think I dig into this a little bit later too, but it's things like maybe embedding a video, and it doesn't necessarily have to be one that you created, but it's something, if it's relevant to the topic, if it helps the person reading get another understanding, that could be useful. It's things like we add a lot of GIFs or GIFs, however you prefer to say it. Stuff like that is really great for getting people to keep scrolling. Even custom graphics and things like that can also add some value and just a little bit of color to the written content you're creating. It's really, people get overwhelmed if they see a wall of text. So one of the reasons why you include visuals is basically to just break up the text. I think that high quality content, this is not a hard and fast rule, but it tends to be long form in nature, just because not necessarily the longer the blog post, the better, but it's just more opportunities to answer questions for readers. If you're writing something that's 500 words long, for example, that's about a page of written copy, and it's usually not sufficient for the types of topics that we're writing for our clients, in terms of answering reader questions and diving into the related topics that they might also be interested in. And finally, and kind of on the same note, high quality content is the perfect answer to that searcher's query. And you may or may not be concerned with SEO, just depending on the nature of the content you're creating and the audiences where you distribute that content. But at the end of the day, SEO or not, you should be always keeping that user, that end reader in mind. For me, just as much as I'm trying to please my clients, I'm really ultimately, my ultimate stakeholder is that end reader, because if they don't like what I've written, then it can't serve its purpose for the company I wrote it for. So one company, organization, agency that I look to as kind of a mentor is Orbit Media Studios. I think they create a lot of really excellent content, and their content on a more meta level also gives you a lot of ideas to create your own content, because they are a web design and like marketing agency. So a lot of the topics they share are for that audience, somebody who is wanting to improve their web design, their marketing. And so a couple of things I've learned from Orbit Media. First is to create the best resource possible for the topic. And that's why, again, my definition of high quality content is longer form in nature, because you don't necessarily want to beat whatever's ranking, for example, at the top of relevant search for whatever your industry is, in terms of words alone, but that is one metric to keep in mind in terms of like the depth of how you're getting into that content. So that's one thing to think about, is just length, but really length is correlated to all the subtopics within it. So it's also doing things like making sure to keep tabs on the competition. So if you haven't defined who your competitors are, this is a good reminder to do that. And I think one of my next tips will shed a little bit more light into how specifically to do that. And then just another thing to share from Orbit Media is every year they do this blogger survey. And so they survey 1,000 bloggers, and they ask them things like, how long did it take you to write your average blog post? Like, what's the word count? It asks about different parts of the process for these different bloggers. And it's really interesting to look at it year after year and to see how the trends are changing. And I think that it's something that you can use to determine if you're more or less like on trend with what content marketing is developing into. Again, because it does change every year when they do this survey. There are major differences. And so I'd recommend going on Orbit Media's website and looking at what happened last year, the last time they did it. So this is what I was talking about with competitors. Using a tool like Ahrefs, some of the other big ones like SEMrush or Moz, I think have the same functionality, but there's this feature called running a content gap analysis. And as you can kind of see from this screenshot, you basically put in your domain, your blog, and then up to, I think, 5 of your competitors that you want to benchmark yourself against. And what this will do is it will show you what are some of the low hanging fruit opportunities that you have to beat them for certain keywords that they're ranking for, but you're not currently ranking for. So it's just one way to keep tabs on the competition. It may or may not make sense for you to use a tool like Ahrefs. Transparently, it's about $100 a month for the lowest plan. And for me, it makes sense because I run a content agency. But for those of you that don't, it might make more sense to seek out some alternative tools. But I just wanted to point out that this is a feature on one of my favorite tools, Ahrefs. So when it comes to just how do I come up with blog ideas, a couple of things that have helped me in certain industries for certain clients are things like listening to different podcasts, reading books that are related to the topic, going to conferences, and just keeping your ears open for the things that people are talking about that you may not have heard of before. If you work in the traditional office environment that relates to your blog, just kind of listening to what colleagues are talking about. I guess another way that you could do this is if you're a member of different online communities related to your blog, just again, kind of keeping your ears open for anything that they're discussing there that might be relevant to you that you can weigh in on. Creating like an RSS feed of related topics is another great way to have inspiration automatically coming to you. And then I'll talk about this a little bit later, but looking at Google search data for related topics can also be a really useful way to build out your content calendar. It's important to be successful with content creation, especially on the blogging side. Make sure that you always have something to write on so that when inspiration strikes, you can act on it. For me, I really like Evernote because I can just open it, and as soon as I have an idea, just type it in. And I use tags and notebooks and different things like that to organize it, so it's easier to go back on. And then, for those of you who are a little bit more analog in nature, just having a little notebook that you carry on you, that can be, if you don't want to be distracted by your phone, I think that that's a good alternative. I also use this tool or this product called Rocketbook. And what it lets you do is you can write on it with erasable pen, and then you can scan it. And then it like reads the text so that you could search the text. And I have it synced with Evernote. So that's another way that you can kind of combine the digital and the analog depending on how you best take down ideas. But I think the main point that I wanted to get across here was just, as soon as you have an idea, put it down, because otherwise you're going to forget. It's also important to have a system for organizing your ideas. So using some sort of blog editorial calendar. The screenshot that you see here is Notion, but it's a Kanban view, which you would find on something like Trello or Asana. It's not so much important what tool you use to create an editorial calendar. It's more important that it's something that you already understand and know, that you're not trying to learn a new tool necessarily. Something that fits within your existing workflow would be the best tool. And I can't remember, I didn't link to it, but HubSpot has a really excellent blog editorial calendar. If you were to Google it, it lets you organize like other related marketing and promotions in tandem with topics, and it doesn't necessarily give you the room to expand on those topics within the editorial calendar itself, but you could always like link Google Doc briefs to it or something like that. So just a couple different ideas. And then you can see here I've organized things by, is it an idea that hasn't necessarily been developed or acted on? In progress is something that I've probably outlined at least. In review is something that's been drafted but might need some edits. And then update needed is something that I've written before but need to update because maybe it's just out of date with the stats. And then published, self-explanatory, it's been published to the blog. So that's just one way to do it, but you can add other steps. Another step that I would add that we'll talk about a little bit later is a promotional step. What do you do after it's published? So it all depends on your workflow. I would set it up according to how you best work, and that's just how I do it. So we're going to talk a little bit about the research stage of writing a blog post. It starts with having good sources that you're using to do this research, to get stats, to get ideas. And a couple of things you want to keep in mind are things like, is this source considered an authority in their industry? This is something that Google is going to care more and more about moving forward. There's this principle or way that they think of content called EAT. It's expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness. And if you were to read through Google's search quality rater guidelines, they go into a lot more detail on it. But the point being that authorship is going to become more and more important moving forward, and what Google understands about you as the author of the content, and if you are someone with authority on the subject. But the same thing can be said about the sources you use. It's not just from the writer's perspective, but what are you including in your content to help Google understand that it's something that's well researched and that's considering outside viewpoints, I guess, to create it. For certain industries, timeliness is really important, especially where I work in digital marketing. Things change all the time. So if I'm quoting a stat from 3 or 4 years ago, there's a good chance it's already out of date. I would think for things like science, business in general, maybe best practices, things like that. It's important to be very timely with the sources that you choose, and things like psychological studies, experiments, and things like that. It might not be possible to have a super timely updated source, but those should be kind of the exception, not the rule. And then also you have to think about reputation. When you're sharing information, I mean, I think it's the same thing with just like reading the news. Like you want to get your information from a source that, at least if they're biased, that they disclose the bias, or that they try not to let the bias affect how they share information with you, but also that they are credible in where they're getting that information from. So all things to consider with the sources that you're going to add to your content or to create your content. And I'm not sure if I talk about this later or not, but for every piece of content that we create, we're adding somewhere around 2 expert sources per 500 words as a signal to Google that we are considering, outside opinions and quoting studies from people who are smarter than us, quite frankly. So if you tend to write within a certain niche, I've kind of talked about this, but follow, create an RSS feed of those relevant blogs, and also find the newsletters that share information, like a digest, things like that. There's a lot of them in the marketing world that I'm subscribed to. As you get more niche with the different blogs that all of you represent, it's going to look a little bit different, but see what communities, newsletters, blogs that you can find that you can refer to stay on top of trends and to know as things change, essentially. Another thing that I've been doing is sometimes I will there'll be a situation where I need to share the same sources over and over again. So something that comes to mind is we write a lot about digital marketing and SEO best practices for the clients that we create content for, because they're wanting to share that with their audience. A lot of small business owners who are trying to be effective online with their marketing. And so things like Google algorithm ranking signals and the nature of, is it like an official ranking algorithm signal or not? These are things that I store in Evernote for easy reference, like published news from Google about what they have admitted to us as a ranking signal. So there's different situations for that. I've actually, since I made this presentation, I've changed this a little bit to being, instead of just Evernote, because I want to share it with my team, I have changed this to being more of like a spreadsheet where I go into different industries, different publications, and things like that, so that they have some jumping off points to do their research, as well as those statistics that seem to come up time and time again, like the Google ranking signals that I want to be able to quote back to Google. This specific piece of advice is probably most useful if you're pitching something as like a guest post on somebody else's blog, but it could be useful to you if you're creating a lot of content and you just can't remember what you've covered last. But just to figure out if a topic has been covered before on a given blog, use these search operators here. So the quotes, the topic being in the quotes, and then cite semicolon, whatever the URL of the website is. And then depending on how they structure their blog, if it is a guest post, for example, you might want to add /blog or blog dot whatever the domain is, so that you're not returning in the search that you're performing, anything from a static page like home, about, services. Like you just want to see what's on the blog specifically. And so using this search and putting in, for example, a keyword about, some sort of topic that you want to write, that will help you see if they've already done it before. And again, it's really most important if you're pitching someone, whether it's a guest post or if you want to write for them as a freelance writer. Editors appreciate the people who show some level of having done their research, essentially. So when doing research, you're going to come across articles that are probably going to be somewhat similar to what you're trying to create just by nature of doing research. And so when it comes to taking inspiration from these pieces, a couple tips here so that it doesn't become plagiarism. First of all, obviously don't copy it. You got to add value. You got to add some sort of unique voice or angle, some sort of unique aspect. Another tip that has helped me is to, before you do the research phase, just do a brain dump, kind of start your outline and create a basic article structure before you start that research so that you're not influenced by what you find during research. You're only kind of like validating your opinions and adding to them at that point. And researching anything that you just don't know, or statistics, things like that. And then on that note, when you're looking at other articles that are similar to what you're creating, use them to find things like statistics or quotes that you want to add, things like that, more so than the actual ideas. That's where you start to get in trouble with potential plagiarism. And even if you're not trying to plagiarize something, it might be a good idea to use a tool like Copyscape, or Grammarly Premium also has a like content plagiarism checker, just to make sure that, if you added something in, it's not verbatim from somewhere else. Like sometimes what I'll do too is if I'm adding like a stat or something, and I want to make sure that I don't word it in a way that is incorrect, like it's capturing the same meaning, but not in the same exact words. Sometimes I'll just add it to my outline in red as a signal that I need to change it. So another way that you can add a unique angle to your content is to interview topic experts or seek outside expert quotes by doing some sort of expert roundup. There's a couple different ways that you could do this. You could go to your own network. Another thing that I'm doing with my writers is putting together a database, actually in the same place where we have some of the sources and statistics that get reused, but a database of people in my network that they can reach out to and kind of what they're expert on and how to reach them in terms of contact information. So you might want to create that for your own blog too, just a little database that you could refer back to for topical experts that you can ask to contribute quotes. You can also use a tool like Haro, which is Help a Reporter Out, and you can sign up and you can just submit, you say like, oh, I'm working on an article about fill in the blank topic, and looking for expert opinions about whatever. So let's talk about, once you're done with research, or kind of as you're doing research, how to outline your blog posts. For me, when I'm creating the outline, I essentially want to include absolutely everything I need for the draft, at least from what I can tell before writing the draft. I mean, there's probably going to be changes after you start the draft. When you go through edits, that's totally fine. But the point is to include everything that you need, that you know that you need, so that you're not distracted when you're writing that draft and you can just get it all done. Because I find that if I have to go back and track down statistics or quotes, or, did I really put that in right? Or things like that, it becomes something that takes me away from the writing process. And it throws me off. It makes the process take longer than it needs to, essentially. And also, I guess when I first started writing, like freelance writing, I was traveling a lot, and I, wasn't trying to pay for the airplane Wi-Fi. And so I just wanted to get my outlines to a point where I could work on them without internet and then upload them once I was back on Wi-Fi. So that's kind of like a travel tip too. So in terms of what to include, we'll start with kind of a brief. And I think the brief comes before the outline, but it could also be something that you put together kind of at the same time. They both serve very similar purposes, but they're slightly different. So here's a brief example for a client a while back who's an emergency vet. And so they wanted to have some content to attract their ideal customer in terms of other things that they care about when their pet is not having an emergency. And so you can see a couple things here, a couple things I didn't necessarily include on this, but you should think about. One is the goal behind the content. What do you want people to do as a result of this? If you don't have a goal, if you don't know where that person should go after they read, maybe it's not content that you should write. Also the specific topic focus. So something like the title I included in this brief is probably not going to be the end title. It's really just for the writer to take and run with. Any specific information to include. So like I mentioned here, we'll create a calendar resource in terms of vaccinations that, you know, most pets would need, heartworm pills, flea and tick, you know, kind of just creating a resource for them. Any keywords that you know you want to go after, you should definitely have any keyword research done before you draft, because keyword research will essentially inform what content you want to write about and how to structure it. And I think we're going to go through a couple of ways that you can find that in Google search in a bit. So I'll leave it at that for now. I also like to include research material and any competitor content to be. So if it's a competitor, I'll make sure to label that for the writer to say, like, please don't link to this, because we don't want to, you know, give them the benefit of having created this content and optimizing it for SEO. But it's good to know what you're going up against. And finally, you might also define what stage someone's at in the buyer's journey. We're going to talk a little bit about search intent in a bit and how to determine what stage they're in. But the point is that people make purchasing decisions at all these different stages. You know, they start from awareness and then finally the conversion. And the point is that you want to have content that reaches them at every stage in the journey, so that there's always some way that you can push them forward in your own funnel. And, you know, if your blog is more of a personal thing, then maybe this doesn't matter as much to you. But if you ever want to monetize in the future, then it's important to understand your persona and how they make decisions. And I guess on a related note, if you are planning out a content calendar for the year, for the quarter, whatever, it's not just about reaching one persona at every stage, it's about reaching every persona at every stage, but it's something that you can build up over time. So I use these two tools, Phrase and ClearScope. Both of them help me with the briefing process. Both of them help me with the outlining process. I use Phrase probably more for the briefing and ClearScope more after, well, I would say like during drafting / during edits, to make sure that I'm including all the relevant information that I would want to include. And basically the way that these two tools work is they go through the top 30 search results for whatever keyword that you feed them, and it reverse engineers these entities, which are kind of like secondary keywords to include. And it's just based on those top ranking results, what Google is already saying that they like, and giving you the opportunity to build your content similarly. I think the problem with these tools is they can encourage like copycat content where it's not unique, where, you know, it's just trying to optimize for what's already out there. So that's where you need to add that unique angle. You can't just rely on these tools to help you create content. They are just a tool. They're not the whole process. If you're looking for a budget option here, Phrase is probably going to be the one that is a little bit more reasonable for more of like a hobbyist or somebody who's not creating a whole lot of content. For ClearScope, it's a little more expensive. Did anybody have a question before we go on?
I don't think so. We just had somebody new join that wasn't muted.
No worries. All right, cool. So let's keep moving forward here. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the SEO stuff you're going to include in your outline or in your draft. One thing is metadata. So whenever we're creating content for a client, I like to be the one who's in charge of uploading it to their content management system like WordPress, but that's not always the case. And so if it's not me who's uploading it, or even if it's somebody on my team who's uploading it, I guess, I want to specifically make sure that I'm writing out the metadata the way that I want it displayed. So metadata is just what shows up in search. Somebody types a query, they press enter, you have your results. So this is what the results, what formats them essentially. So you have a meta title and a meta description. The title is just kind of like whatever your blog's title would be, you know, for each post. And then the description is just a slightly longer explanation. The thing about metadata is you're kind of writing it with Google in mind, search engine spiders, but at the end of the day, you really have to think about the end user and what would compel them to click through, just like a newspaper with that heading. What speaks to you about certain news stories that gets you to actually take the time to read them. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. Best practices have included using the keyword in both the meta title and description, whatever primary keyword that you're trying to optimize for. But as Google gets more contextual with their algorithm, I'm going to say that within a year, it's probably not going to be necessary to include keywords. For now, I just do it anyway. It's just kind of a safe move to make. But I think more important than including the keyword is to be compelling. So, and you can also, if you use a plugin like Yoast or pretty much any of the big SEO plugins, you can actually set a separate page title from your SEO title. So say, somebody lands on your blog, maybe they came from another website or something, like that's the title that they would see, not necessarily from that search page. So they can be different if you want them to be. They don't necessarily have to be. It just depends on what formatting you're trying to make work and ultimately what you think is the best title for the human reader versus the search engine spider. So as you're structuring the outline, you're also going to want to start obviously thinking about the structure of the blog post. So it helps to start with the introduction. Some people like to write the body out first or start to flesh out those sections, and then the introduction might write itself at that point. I think it just depends on the topic for me. But as far as writing the introduction, my template is to share a problem, a solution, and the reveal is like how we're going to get to that solution. Like, here's what we're going to get to within this article to help you solve this problem. Then we get into the different sections of the outline. So essentially just subheadings and some bullet points to support them. You're not writing at this point, but if you have a good idea that you just want to get out, go ahead and do it, but that's not necessarily the point here. For me, I'm trying to have a new section, a new subheading about every 300 words or so. That seems to be a good rule of thumb with the content that we're creating at the Blogsmith, and it goes into enough depth without making it a huge wall of text. And in the same vein, every 300 words, I'm trying to add a new image as well. So a couple rules of thumb that might help your process. And so, yeah, we're just focusing on whatever points we want to include in the final article and any sort of relevant stats or links that you want to make sure that you're going to include so that you just don't forget. So it's just kind of a brain dump. That's what an outline is. It's like, here's all the things I need to make the draft. It might not be pretty. It might not be super organized, but just kind of bucket the information where it makes sense, and then you can refine it during the draft. So then kind of the mirror image of the introduction is the conclusion. And what I do is just restate the problem again. Here's why we're here. This is why you read this blog post. Summarize the key points you covered in the article. Those might be the subheadings that you talked about. And then end with some sort of call to action. And a couple different ideas for what that call to action might be can be things like trying to increase engagement by saying, hey, tweet your thoughts about this article to whatever your Twitter handle is, or, leave a comment and join in the discussion. It might be something a little bit more of like a macro conversion, like asking them to buy a product or starting a trial. If you're a services business, it might be just asking them to get in touch or to book a demo, something like that. So I think it helps whenever possible to define the CTA even before you write the outline, because it may not make sense to add in the conclusion. It might make more sense to add in one of those subheadings, but if you wait till the end, then you're going to pigeonhole yourself. And so it's just, again, it's a matter of the topic and how to best address it and how to best position whatever you want the reader to do within that topic. A couple extras you might include either on the outline or the draft. Like if you're like me and you're writing for other people and you're submitting it to them and you want to add some extra just usefulness for them, One is any Twitter handles of, for example, stats that you quoted. So, maybe it's like a news outlet or something, or it could be an individual who wrote the article. It could be a brand that you used an example from. It's just a way to collect this information so that when you are ready to promote, that you can say, hey, at whatever brand, we included you in this article, check it out. And they might retweet it, they might share it with their friends, they might link back to it, you don't know, but it's worth it to have this extra step, just to see how far you can take your content when you distribute it, when you promote it. It's also things like adding image options and making sure to share source information. This is especially important for my clients, because they want to make sure that they have a license to use the images so that they don't get sued, essentially. So depending on the outlet that you're creating content for, adding the extra detail of the source might be super important to them. And then we also like to add a list of any sources that were referenced or explicitly linked to within the content. This helps both myself and the editors on our team to go through and make sure that we included the optimal amount of internal links, the optimal amount of external links. And it also, if we have the opportunity to see what other sources the writer referenced, we can go in and check them and make sure that there was no potential for plagiarism. So those are a couple reasons why we include those things. We've kind of talked about this. This is another plagiarism thing. Don't just copy and paste information. Take the time to rephrase it. If you don't have time when you're doing the research, again, just using like red text can be a signal to you that you need to rewrite it. And on a slightly different note, don't waste time calling out the obvious. It's kind of hard to explain without showing you an example, but in this topic of creating high quality content that adds instead of, or that doesn't just add to the void, but that adds something genuinely useful, it's not helpful to just call out the obvious and to waste word count on frivolousness. I guess another way to think about it is many famous authors have been quoted saying that it's a lot harder to write short passages than long, because it requires you to really think about what you're saying and edit and get to the root of whatever the point is. When you're writing and you're thinking about word count over quality, that's where you start to get an issue with something like wasting time calling out the obvious. So I'll leave it at that. You can grab my outline template with this link here. So it's blogsmith.tips minus the vowels in the blogsmith part. And that can hopefully help you to outline your next blog post. And again, you can, if you want to grab my slides, you can also grab the link from there. And they're on Twitter for anybody who joined later. So let's talk a little bit more about visuals. We touched on this at the very beginning, and I want to share a couple of examples based on the things that I share with my writers. The goal is basically, we don't want to get sued. We want to make sure that we are within our rights for using imagery. And also we want to make sure that we're being compelling. So on that note, stock photos, probably not going to be something that really moves the needle as far as including images. The reason is because people see the same stock photos time and time again, and they become fatigued by it. And they're like, oh, this again, I think you probably all have seen certain things over and over again, and immediately have probably been turned off by that piece of content and the lack of originality that went into choosing the visuals. And it's too bad, because maybe the content itself was really good, but unfortunately, the way that it was merchandised is something that is just going to alienate people. That being said, if you were to use stock photos, these are my best recommendations for you. In terms of free ones, Pexels and Unsplash tend to have the best quality that I've found and are the most unique. And then as far as paid, which is going to put you on another level where not everybody is going to be using these, because most people are going to use the free ones. I really like Envato Elements. Deposit photos is something that frequently runs a deal on AppSumo where you can buy a credit pack for like $50 and you get like 100 images or something like that. And again, they're going to be more unique than the free ones. And then Jump Story is really interesting because it has like an AI backed search engine where you can find really granular types of images that you might not find on these other stock photo sites. And they also have a form where you can say, hey, I'm not finding the stock photo I want. Can you help me locate this? And then you describe it for them. So I'm going to give you some other ideas for creating or incorporating engaging visuals. I'm just going to say stock photo sites. That's not it. Like it's kind of a crutch, I would say. I get why people use them, but I'm just here to say like it's not going to advance your goals by that much. It's better to use those as more of an inspiration for the end imagery that you want to use. So a couple, let me see. Okay, I do have examples. So just a list to share here, and then we'll go into some examples, things that we use in our process, some sort of fun, relevant GIF, some sort of relevant YouTube video, branded statistics are always nice, creating images for the experts that you quote in related content, sharing specific examples, especially in the WordPress world, having screenshots with annotations of things like the dashboard if you're trying to show people how to use something, and then also creating custom graphics. So I'm going to show you an example of each. This one's not going to work because it's just static, but just go on Giphy. You can find pretty much anything you could ever dream of, depending on your keyword inputs. And we use GIFs for like the majority of the articles that we're creating because people just love them. This one's not going to load either, but having some sort of YouTube video, for example, again, it doesn't have to be something that you created as long as it's relevant and it adds value. So let's just say, for example, I'm writing a blog about a software review. I might add in a video from that software, you know, from the creator of the software that shows how to use it or something like that. So then branded statistics, this is from Statista, and you can use Statista. There's free and paid accounts. I've never paid for one. So you can get a lot of really useful details, especially like in the digital marketing world from Statista. And these look really nice and flashy on an article where you're trying to prove a point about something. So that's a pretty low lift. There's other places where you can find nice stylized data, but this is a good go-to. And you could also, like, let's say that you have a customer who has done their own data research, you could make these for them as a custom graphic. And then it's something that, you know, people want to share these types of things. So it's something that can help with your content distribution. So if you contribute to an expert roundup, sometimes the places that are publishing those roundups will create like a caricature or an illustration or something like that. So that was the case here. This is for, I think, Rank Watch. They did some sort of SEO topic and asked for quotes, and then they made this cool illustration for everybody. And it just has a nice pop, and it makes it easier for, I think, all the people who contributed quotes to then share it on their social networks. Like, oh, look at this little illustration they made of me, and it's conversation starter. And I think it doesn't even have to be an illustration, but just to have something that's on brand for your brand, using your typography, your colors, things like that. It just adds a little something extra to an article. And it's not hard to come up with those images. You don't have to be super creative to, you know, art direct, that type of thing. So this was from an article that I wrote for Code and WP, and it was about like when you get an email after you make an e-commerce purchase, like a confirmation email, or I think it was a shipping confirmation email roundup with a bunch of different examples. And so this was an example that hit my inbox that I thought, you know, was funny, and like it made an impact on me. And so things like examples that you just see from brands in real life, depending on what you're talking about, you know, there's different places to find those examples. Like, let's just say, for example, I'm writing an article about Facebook ad examples. On Facebook, you can go in and see what ads, you know, any brand is running at a given time. And so you have to figure out where to find those examples, but it could be a matter of just like, again, signing up for industry emails and just waiting for them to roll in. And then what I was talking about with like WordPress specifically, a lot of the content we're creating for clients is how-to in nature. And so things like using the WordPress dashboard, sharing screenshots, and not just screenshots, but annotating them to point to where we want people to look. It's a pretty low lift. I use Cloud App for this, but there's so many screenshot and annotation tools. It doesn't really matter which one you use. But yeah, there are free and paid solutions out there. And I would recommend getting familiar with them if you handle any sort of technical content. And then finally, creating custom graphics. So we use Design Pickle. It just allows you to kind of maintain a queue of requests throughout the month. And so my writers can just submit things as they have needs for different pieces of content. This was something that we created. It was an article about like Facebook ad costs or something like that. And, it was just nice to be able to provide the client with something custom branded for them that nobody else is going to have. It wasn't a stock photo, and it also wasn't a heavy lift because we didn't do the graphic design. We just outsourced it to Design Pickle. So maybe it makes sense for you to work with a design team or a designer, or maybe you're the designer and it's creating stuff on Canva. But I think that anything that you do to add a custom branded edge to something, it really stands out. It really makes a difference. So a couple of just best practices to keep in mind for every image on your page. Make sure that you're using high quality image files. You're going to want to use some sort of compression once they are uploaded to your website as kind of a best practice in terms of page speed. That's something that's really big with Google, and big image sizes are something that could get in the way of your page loading quickly. So there's different plugins you could use like Short Pixel or Smush, and they both have free and paid versions. Making sure to, again, attribute sources, add captions to explain why you've included that image. It's also really important to incorporate whatever your primary keyword is in both the file name and also in the alt tag. So the purpose of the alt tag is for a screen reader, for somebody who has some sort of access issue like blindness, for example, to be able to understand why you've included an image and to kind of explain it to them. So what I like to do is use the keyword in a way that explains what the image is and not just leaving it at the keyword itself. So we're getting close-ish to the end here. We're going to talk a little bit about just defining style for yourself with the goal of producing consistent high quality content. Here's a couple things that I share with new writers on my team to assimilate to the Blogsmith style as quickly as possible. First of all, just writing short sentences and paragraphs. So a sentence should be ideally less than 2 lines or no more than 2 lines. And with paragraphs, 3 lines or less of just like typed on the page, like in Google Docs, for example. This is because people, I've said it already, but they get really overwhelmed by large block text. And so to see the white space between the paragraphs, these short paragraphs, makes it easy for them to either skim or read. Making it skimmable in general is important. And you can also add white space by using formatting tools like bullet lists. So whenever possible, we're adding bullet lists when something is kind of a series instead of creating a big paragraph about it. Making sure your headings and anchor text being what you would click to go somewhere else if you included a source, making sure that they're descriptive so that people understand what they would find if they clicked or if they read in that area. And then there's something that I've been using lately, and maybe I can pop it in the chat here. In terms of defining your tone, the Nielsen Norman Group put together this list or this guidance. I'm going to drop this in the chat really quick. They put together this spectrum of voice and tone, and it's basically like funny versus serious, formal versus casual, respectful versus irreverent, and enthusiastic versus matter of fact. If you haven't already, define what your blog's tone is. And for any clients that you might have that you do writing for it, same thing. This is really kind of like the bare minimum as far as defining style or defining tone specifically. And it's really hard to write well for a brand without doing this. Also defining perspective. So first would be like if I'm writing about my experience and I'm using a lot of I words, most of the content we create for the Blogsmith is from the you, the second perspective, where we're kind of inviting the reader in by saying you and referring to them. And then a last note here is to just avoid cliches, avoid trite ways of saying things that are often repeated and kind of easy to ignore. And I think that this goes along with what we talked about before in terms of being concise and saying what you mean and not wasting time on just extrapolating for word count. So we talked a little bit about this. You can use AP style to define your style. And then if you want to see an example of a completed style guide that's based on AP style, you can check out mine using this link. And you can kind of see how it's organized with the screenshot here. We go into things like general style, how to use keywords, headings, how to format links, word choice, and so on. So please use that as a resource if it's useful to you. All right, so let's talk about the draft. I think the most important thing is to not overthink it when you're ready to do like the main writing. That's not the research part of things. The idea is you want to find your focus. And so I use the Pomodoro method, which is 25 minutes of focus time and then 5 minutes for a break. And you have to take the break, otherwise it doesn't really work. But using this, if I have like a great outline and I'm writing, just for example, a 500 word piece, I can knock out that 500 word piece in 25 minutes if I have a good outline and if I actually focus on the task. The main thing is to just show up. It's hard to get started if you have a blank page, but if you have done the work with your outline, it's going to be a pretty quick flow at this point. And so I think another thing that's worth mentioning is separating out the steps. Outlining ideally is done on a separate day than drafting, and editing is done ideally on a different day than drafting or outlining for that matter. At minimum, if you have to do something in a day, just do separate work sessions, and that will also help to make your brain work in a way where you can kind of think between the sessions to add in anything that might be missing. You might be working with an editor or not, but a couple tips for effective self-editing. First of all, to just read it over once when you're done. You might think that you were like kind of editing while you were writing it. I don't think that's a good way to do things because it's just going to make the drafting process take longer. The whole point of the draft is to just get through it. The point of the draft is to not have a perfect final output. That's what the editing stage is for. So do a once over once you're completely done and just look for any spelling, grammar, awkwardness, whatever, things like that. So then the next step is to read your draft out loud. You could also use a text-to-speech tool if you don't want to use your own voice. And that'll help you to find any agreement issues, anything that sounds awkward that you wouldn't hear by reading it yourself in your own head. And then another important self-editing step is just like, is it actually interesting? Is this draft you produce something that doesn't add to the void of content, but actually contributes a unique angle? Is it serving your target and customer or audience reader, for example? So making sure that you do that before publishing, I think, is a pretty important step. And if the answer is no, then you need to go back to the drawing board. We're just going to talk quickly about, I think, content, SEO, and then promotions. And then I think that's the end. So talking about keyword research is kind of outside of the scope of today, like going super deep into it. I'm going to give you a couple of tips, but if you want to dive deeper, I have a resource for that here. But what I really wanted to share as sort of an easy win for this audience is going through Google to find related data. So let's just pretend that my primary keyword is seed keyword, which is just a term that we would use to kind of refine a keyword into the one that we actually want to use in a blog post. It's like my first assumption at what the keyword is before validating it with data. And so there's a couple of places you can look at Google for things that will help you flesh out your outline and then your draft as a result. So first is Google autocomplete. So that's just when you type in the keyword and it'll show you other data based on actual Google searches. So that's this one on the far left here. You know, some of it's going to be useful, some of it's not. You kind of have to take it with a grain of salt, but these are potential related topics to include in your content about that keyword. So then we have people also ask, just kind of starting from the bottom here. And people also ask our questions related to your primary keyword that you've typed in. And it's things that people want to learn. And so this is a really great way to start to structure your outline based on answering these questions for them. And then it used to be called searches related to, it's called related searches now, but this is at the bottom of that first page of Google. And it suggests related topics that may or may not make sense to include in the content we're talking about today, but might be a good follow-up to talk about in the future that is related and that people, you know, would understand as being related if you created a series of content or, you know, a bunch of related content. So all these things, you know, free data in Google, you don't need a fancy tool like Ahrefs, for example, to get this data. You know, what it doesn't include is things like how many monthly searches there are or how difficult it would be to rank for these keywords, but not super concerned with that if you are using the data to flesh out your content. There's some other tools that you could use to add on to this. One is Keywords Everywhere, and the other one is Keyword Surfer. Both of these are Google Chrome extensions that show additional data within Google search, kind of like these things that you're seeing here. I wanted to share some details about featured snippets. This is definitely going to be super high level. And if this is something that intrigues you, I would definitely recommend looking more into it. But a featured snippet is something that ranks in position 0. So it's something that ranks ahead of all organic results and basically at the bottom of any paid like ads. And so you can kind of see here it's formatted a little bit differently than typical search where there's like a bordered box. And there's different types of featured snippets. The one that you're seeing here is what's called a paragraph snippet, where essentially it's kind of a definition. There's also list snippets that are more like bullet point or, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4 for something like if I wanted to, or if I search something like best social media management tools, there might be a list snippet that lists out a couple of them. But the cool thing about featured snippets is that you don't have to be in the top 10 or even the top 20, I don't think, to be able to rank a featured snippet. So it's a good opportunity for somebody who may not be owning the search engine results page, which is just what you're seeing here after you type a keyword. It's the search engine results page. It's a chance to rank if you're not ranking in the top 10. I think they typically take from the top 30 results. So if you're within that range, you might be able to beat whatever the current featured snippet is. And essentially, just like in this previous step, it's always important to whatever you're trying to optimize for to look at Google and see what Google says, because that's going to give you a lot of context about how your content should turn out. And that's why I use tools like ClearScope and Phrase. It's just a way to kind of quicken that process of getting all that data in one place. But again, you can do it yourself by just searching keywords and seeing what comes up and understanding why Google surface those results and then trying to create something essentially better than that or with a different angle. So I won't say too much more about featured snippets besides to say that you should be thinking about them and you should learn more about them with a deeper dive. So I mentioned this earlier in terms of the buyer's journey, and this definition of search intent is a little bit outdated, but it's a good model to introduce the concept. So there's essentially 3 major types of search intent. The first one's navigational, and it's where somebody's typing something into Google that shows that maybe they don't have the right URL. So they might type something like Facebook login. You know, most people know, just type facebook.com, right? But certain people might type things like that, or Gmail, you know, like yes, you could just write gmail.com, but sometimes we use search to more quickly find parts of a website that we could probably find on our own eventually, but you know, it's a convenience factor. And so we're not necessarily trying to optimize for keywords like that, but if you're tracking that in something like Google Search Console, Google Analytics, it can show that maybe there's a navigational issue on your website if people are using branded terms in reference to navigating to certain things. So that's why I think they're worth paying attention to. Informational is when people use keywords like how to, for example, they're seeking an answer. They may not be looking for a paid solution at this point. They might be, it's hard to say, but at this stage, the keywords that they're using shows that they're aware that there's a problem, but maybe not that they're actively looking for a paid solution. They might be looking for a solution, but maybe not a paid one. And then transactional is things like, top 10 of a certain category, like TVs for 2021, or your brand name promo code, or it might be like a comparison between your brand and your competition and things like that. And so when people are using transactional keywords, that's a pretty good sign that they're ready to convert, whether that's with you or your competition. It's kind of up to you to create the content that convinces them one way or another. So that's, again, a very super high level way to look at search intent. And if it's something that intrigues you, and if you're trying to build out these different buyers stage elements for your content journey, I would recommend digging into that more as well. In terms of using keywords, once you find them, you're going to want to use them in places like the URL of your blog posts. And if your keyword is more than one word, then use a dash to separate them so Google can read them as separate words. Using it in your URL is probably one of the most important places to use whatever keyword that you're trying to optimize for. And then another quick tip, eliminate categories and dates in your blog URL structure, so it's easier to rank for your specific keyword, because it's just another thing for Google to read. It's just like extraneous data that is really not necessary. And if you're already using those, you can redirect what it is to what you want it to be with something like, I think redirection is a plugin. There's like a 301 redirects plugin, something that you're going to want to talk to somebody technical about if you haven't done it before, but pretty easy to do once you understand it. We talked about meta description, so use a keyword there. I try to include whatever keyword I'm primarily trying to rank for in at least one heading tag. So the H2, the H1 is like your page title, and then the H2, H3, H4, et cetera, are just subheadings and subheadings of subheadings, et cetera. So H2 is kind of the most important. If you could fit it somewhere else, great, but not mission critical. Again, Google is getting a lot more contextual, so even this guideline may change in the next year. And for those of you who don't know, you only should be using one H1 tag per blog post, the title of it, but you can use multiple H2s and H6s on every page without an issue. Just a quick tip, another thing that I tell my writers is that subheadings should be descriptive and include keywords whenever possible. That helps to add description to them, I think. And I define descriptive as being 3 to 5+ words in length without becoming a run-on sentence where it takes like 2 lines of text. It's just some tips for using keywords in text content. So another thing to deep dive in, if you're curious, is Google's BERT algorithm update. What this algorithm update did was Google only used to understand reading a sentence one way, but now it understands how all the words relate to each other if you read it forwards or backwards. I guess as a best practice, try to include your keyword as much as seems natural without overdoing it to the point where it sounds weird. Not the best guideline, but something to keep in mind. Our rule of thumb is 4 times per 500 words. And I'm going to give you a couple of tips for how to do that. I think even that might be overdoing it at this point. I think 2 to 3 would be great. So here's some ways to incorporate keywords if you're just lacking ideas. In the introduction, you could say, let's dig into this guide about keyword. Whenever I'm creating a conclusion, the subheading I format as final thoughts and then the SEO title, because I've already included the keyword in the SEO title, so I know it's already done. And then you could also say something in the conclusion like share your thoughts about keyword in the comments. So right there, that's 3 ways to use the keyword that you could do for every blog post that you write. Okay, this is the last section. A couple ideas for promoting your content. Social media is a great place to promote things, whether that's on your channels or somebody else's. So a couple ways to do this are doing things like installing social share buttons. I really like Social Warfare. They have a free and pro version, a free and paid version for WordPress. That just encourages people to share. It's like a call to action. Adding click to tweets, that's really similar, where you basically pull out like a quote or statistic, and it's another call to action where people see it. And if they, are intrigued by that quote, they might want to share it with their audience, and you can add like your Twitter handle to that to track it. A lot of actually WordPress brands don't do this next thing, which is adding a Pinterest specific image and share text. This is something that you can define on the pro version of Social Warfare, but not the free version. And it's just such a missed opportunity. If you look up like WordPress tutorials on Pinterest, it's like a graveyard. There's really nothing there. So if you write stuff about WordPress, like definitely get your Pinterest on, because you could just own it. Customizing the open graph tags. So that's just what shares on Facebook or Twitter, like any other social channel, when you get like the preview of a link. So you could set those after your meta information. Maybe you want to customize them further. For some clients, we also write social share copy that they can just use on their channels to share something without having to think too much about it. If something's new, you might want to pin it to your Twitter and Facebook pages, so it's the first thing you see, kind of like how I pinned my slides for this talk at the top of my Twitter channel for today, just making it easy to find. And then two other tools I use. Missing Letter basically takes your published blog URL and generates several different social copy variations, and it also creates these really cool quote images. It's just like scraping your article for content, and you can customize it, but it just makes it really easy to quickly create a social sharing campaign. And then Q Promote is really interesting because it allows you to submit your content for other people to share on their channels, and it doesn't say like sponsored when they share it, because they're not paying you. You're paying the platform, they're paying the platform, but it's a cool way for you to share content and share it from another person's account, essentially, who obviously opts into certain categories and things like that. Couple last thoughts. We already talked about tweeting at everybody involved. If you're creating a list of all the brands that you're talking about, or writers that you quoted, things like that. This is especially useful in the WordPress world. There's a lot of newsletters, and they're always looking for content to share. So make their jobs easier and just pitch them your content and say why you think it's relevant to share in their newsletter. And, maybe add in something with your pitch about how you're, a reader of their newsletter and, what you like about it. You could syndicate content. If you don't do this right, this could be problematic for you. It could become a duplicate content issue. So another thing to deep dive in before you fully commit. But like in my industry, Business to Community is a big content syndication site. And the way that they're set up allows me to share my blog content word for word on their website, and just giving me a bigger audience, essentially. You could also send it out with your own email list. So not just other people's newsletters, but yours as well. And then another thought is you could take your blog post to the next level. I had an example and now I'm blanking on it. That emergency vet example I gave earlier, where I was talking about like a calendar of vaccinations, like that could be a great content upgrade to design it and to create it as like a downloadable PDF, and to ask for somebody's email in exchange for that is another way that you can build your audience. So it's kind of a final thought here. Whenever you're creating blog content, make sure somebody's waiting for it before you publish it. This example is from Rand Fishkin. The idea comes from Orbit Media, again, one of my favorite content mentor teams. But Rand Fishkin, he kind of teases an article he's about to publish, and he's done this for a lot of them, and said, here's when you can expect to to read it, essentially creating an audience before the blog has even gone live, because he's kind of teasing it and getting people interested in the content, wondering what he's going to say about it. So I think there's a lesson here for all of us, which is like, don't publish to an audience that hasn't been warmed up in some way. You can involve people in the creation process, and that's going to probably increase your readership by the time it's actually published. All right, so with that, I'm all done.
All right, we must have some questions going on here.
Yeah, I'm looking through to see.
There were some people that had to leave, so we missed a couple of people. We had one person ask how much keyword should be in the first outline.
So basically in my process with the writers that I work with, before they start the outline, they have all the keyword research. And what we include specifically is one or multiple primaries. We include secondary keywords based on the Google data I showed you. So the autocomplete, the people also ask, etc. And also any suggestions that pop out at us from ClearScope. We're also defining a specific featured snippet that we're going after, because that's going to be like one subheading of the outline. And then I'm trying to think if there's anything else that we define at that point. But essentially, before starting the outline, I want the writer to have all that information, because it's going to impact how they write about the topic. So I guess in terms of answering the question, like all the keywords.
All of them.
All of them.
Other questions for Maddy?
I saw one about Pinterest too.
Yeah, I answered that one already.
Okay.
Basically that you can't know if a picture in Pinterest is copyrighted or not. So you shouldn't be using them. Just like using Google search for images, you shouldn't do that either.
Right.
Yeah. You're not using copyrighted images.
And it's probably worth mentioning for those that aren't super familiar with Pinterest, it's a different image orientation. So like WordPress, we kind of have that rectangle, like sideways length rectangle for a featured image, just as a general rule. It's like exactly the opposite for Pinterest, where it's the top, the length is the top rectangle. So it really is something that you have to put an effort into. You can't just kind of like squeeze the featured image into Pinterest dimensions and expect it to work, unless you've centered all your text in a way that, so I guess what I'm trying to say is, you have to create a dedicated Pinterest image in order for it to perform well on Pinterest, because Pinterest users don't like seeing featured image orientated photos.
Yeah, that makes sense. Other questions? We've lost a few people, so there are probably fewer questions than we might have had otherwise.
Sure, no worries.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Maddy.
Hi.
Questions? Wow, that was you must be exhausted. You covered everything, I think.
It's a lot to think about, for sure.
No, it's wonderful. It's I'd like to give the presentation to people and just say, here, look at this. Kind of a question, because you're building content for other people.
Sure.
One of the things I'm interested in is getting authority in an area, in a topic area. Is there anything like that you steer differently for like blog posts as opposed to like building content hub, like pillar type material? Do you do any of that sort of thing?
I think that so the topic that you're kind of bringing up that we haven't discussed yet is the idea of topic clusters, which is essentially that you are creating a lot of like content that's very related. Like each topic is a slight variation on a theme, and then you bring it all together in what's called a pillar page, where you're linking to all these pieces and helping Google to understand, the relation of those things to what you do, and to show them that you have relevance, you have authority, that you have a depth of knowledge in whatever that pillar page is covering. So, I mean, I think in terms of what's the difference between that strategy and blog posts is like, this may or may not be answering your question, but I mean, blog posts are more of like a one-off thing. They're kind of an island. I mean, ideally, you want everything to relate back to what your expertise is, what your authority is. But by following a topic cluster strategy and being very purposeful with the content you're creating and planning it to go live, you know, in a similar amount of time and things like that, I think that's a better strategy. I think that that's ultimately going to move the needle a lot more than having all these different ideas with all sorts of different categories and all sorts of different topic focuses. It ultimately, I guess it depends. What's the goal of your content? Do you want it to rank in search? Then you should think about topic clusters. If there's another reason that you're creating that content, like for example, let's say that you want to create content because you want to be a thought leader, and you know, maybe the things that you're sharing is not something that lends well to keyword research. Well, in that case, topic clusters are probably not going to be super relevant to you, right? But I think that you should enter the content strategy planning stage for, you know, your blog or for a client's blog with that cluster that strategy in mind.
Okay.
But there are probably going to be good situations and use cases for things that aren't tangentially related to what you're covering in your topic.
It seems like you would use the same style, and I mean a lot of the same.
Yes.
There's not much difference in the principles between, I mean, the pillar page may be different that pulls everything together, but these individual pieces, it seems like everything that you're doing here, as opposed to like a blog post.
Sure.
Because like
right.
I'm in an industry where engineers hate the idea of a blog.
Yeah.
You can call it a knowledge hub and it's
Sure.
fine.
Yeah, of course.
It can be identical content, but they won't read a blog because it's kind of more personal, unless you're a real authority in the area.
The label. The label can affect the way that content is interpreted, the way that people read it. It's always interesting to me when somebody labels their blog something that's not blog on their website, like even something like news. I mean, there's a difference between news and a blog. Some people might treat them the same, some brands might treat them the same, but it's really, there is a nuance there. It kind of reminds me, this is a little bit of a ramble, but like a project that I'm working on right now for a client, we're creating guides. So it's not a blog.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
I'm not inviting the reader to engage at the end of them. So something like that is different, but everything about how we're selecting images, how we're formatting it, you know, minus the differences between like these guides follow a certain template in terms of what we would go after for each one. But yeah, I mean, structurally, the label is the main difference, right? It's the structure is pretty much the same.
It also seems, although you might have a little different structure, you'd go through the same process.
Right.
Pretty much.
Yeah, the keyword research stage, like we still do that. That's still an important part of informing the structure. Yeah, so it's like, so I think if hopefully this answers your question, but you can use these principles, I think, regardless of the type of content it is. And even if it's not SEO content, even if the end user or the end client or whatever is not concerned with ranking and search, still having that stage where you go through the Google data, I think there's a purpose for that.
I do too. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely.
Hi, Maddy. I'm sorry, I can't pull up my video, but I hope you can hear me well.
Yep.
Hi. So thank you. So actually, you covered a lot of things. I'm so glad I joined.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So it's really based on the same question that he asked you. Sure. So I'm looking to see if I either create a website or a blog. So I'm still looking into it, but I have a niche. Like I know exactly what I want to write about.
Okay.
Now I don't want to go like write about, like different things and different topics. Like I really want to focus in one topic.
Okay.
But the thing is, I'm not sure if I should blog or I should just create a website. I want to offer my services also, like, creating content for, for businesses or etc. But I really, like, I'm not sure if I want to talk, because I see that a blog looks like you are talking about yourself and your
It could be.
experiences
Mm.
and things like that. So I'm not sure, like, what would be the difference, like, between blogging and just creating a
Content
website,
on a
because at the
website.
end the content, like you said, like, is the same. So
Sure. Okay, so there's a couple things here. So I think one thing I think that's probably worth clarifying, I think that it's a different process to write web page copy than a blog. Even like within my own agency, again, like the keyword research, a lot of that looks the same, but then the actual formatting of stuff, it follows the same principles, but ultimately we're talking about like a very different piece of content. So I think you're right to question the difference between like writing your home about services pages, for example, versus a blog. I guess I would challenge you to expand your perception of what a blog is. I think probably a lot of people on this call today treat their blog as like a personal place where they can expand on their hobbies and, like an online diary of sorts, but they're sharing with other people. But I think that what a blog has evolved into is, it's not just that. It's, for me, for my clients, every new blog is a new set of keywords that we have the opportunity to rank for. So it's a new opportunity to show Google that we understand what we're talking about. And, here's just like the latest entry. And I guess another way that you could look at it from the perspective of somebody who wants to offer services and who's questioning if they should have a blog or not. One thing that we're doing at the Blogsmith is the person who helps me with SEO related stuff. We go back and forth a lot about experiments we're trying, or, like best practices and what that looks like as things change with the algorithm and stuff like that. And recently I was like, we should really be blogging about these conversations that we're having, because there's other people who have these same questions and we're already doing all the research. So I've started to have her create blogs about, all these things that we're considering as SEO changes. And I think there's a benefit to that. So I guess just in terms of things that might help you is to think about, like, what are those things that like you're deliberating, that you're trying to work through as far as the things that you would want to offer clients. It's also things like, different trends you're noticing and just weighing in on them and having a unique perspective. I think that, whether you want to use your blog as more of like a diary where you're saying, here's what I'm learning, and, here's some insights I've taken away from those learnings, or if it's more like, I'm just weighing in on trends, or here's some experiments I'm trying. I think there's a value to all of those different things. And it's just a matter of, like, what does your audience respond best to? Or like where can you add the most value for somebody else that you want to attract as a client? So it might be useful to you to look at some other freelancers' blogs and see kind of how they're handling those things.
Okay, because at the end of the day, I mean, it's content, so
Right.
It's they can use that content for their website, for their blog, even though I have a blog. Like as long as I have authority and they, they can see that what I write about is, is good content and is well researched and all that.
Right.
I like you said, like, it's just a different way of like a different approach with a different clientele, maybe. So
Sure.
but definitely I want to know, like, if ever I do a blog, because maybe like maybe a blog is more like a it feels like it's more like a one-on-one, like personal thing,
It
like
can be.
it can touch like people more like emotionally, because they see your life, they see why you're doing this. And I think it attracts more people that that doesn't even read often. Like it just it grabs attention, I think, more than a normal website.
Sure.
So yeah, I think a blog is in this era right now, I think it's a good thing to do. But I wonder, for offering services to companies, like is it no, like other blogs, is it better to have a website, or you can do that on the blog too?
Yeah, so a couple of things here too. I think that you can, I mean, especially with WordPress, it's like you could build your website and have the blog component. So my suggestion would be to build those two things together and not to separate them, because if the blog is something that you are trying to optimize for SEO, for example, it's going to benefit the rest of your website to have the blog hosted on the same space, the same platform, same domain name, things like that. I was also going to say, just hearing you talk, that I think that having your own blog on your website, if you're building up a portfolio, whether that's writing or even, whatever specific service it is you want to offer, whatever industry you represent, it's a way to show people that you know what you're talking about if you don't have a lot of published samples elsewhere. And then I guess the last thought on the topic is, you mentioned how a blog can be personal. And I think that there's a way to share your unique voice and to share, your personal experience with something. And it's just a matter of also inviting the reader in. So that's where, like, the blogs I'm talking about are not sort of like the diary journal entries that you might be thinking about. But a lot of the content, like if you looked at the Blogsmith and you went back like a year or so, you would see a lot of stuff that's coming from my perspective and me sharing like this is a tool review. Here's how I use it. Here's like why I chose this. Here's the thoughts that were going on in my head before I made the decision to use it. And so there's a way to kind of like have your voice in it, but also to make sure that it's not just about you, but that it also serves the person who reads it. So I think that's something that you're only going to figure it out by just writing and trying different things. And it can be a tough, like finding the right balance that works, but it's worth doing the work to get there. So don't be discouraged.
Thank you so much. You're awesome. Thank you for your honesty.
Absolutely. We have a question from Steve. I think there is a Y on it, right? Maddy at the Blogsmith, he said, on Maddy's last slide, is there supposed to be a dot after the Y in the email address? I think it's just the formatting. It's just Maddy at the blogsmith.com.
Yeah, it's the underscore showing through around the Y.
Yeah, it's just the underline. Any other questions before we wrap? I guess I'll say, feel free to email me if you have any questions, or hit me up on Twitter. I'm happy to help wherever I can. And then I also shared on Twitter, I have a bunch of Skillshare classes that go into a lot of the topics we touched on today with a little bit more focus. So if that's of interest to you, check those out on that pinned tweet. And thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. You always share such really great information and ideas. And I think it's just, we underestimate the power of blogging sometimes, but it's only powerful if we do it right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I write a lot of, I don't blog a lot for myself, but I write a lot of guest posts. And sometimes it's even more imperative that you follow certain formats and everything, and that you think about SEO and you think about topics and things like that, because you're doing it for somebody else, which is even like has a little more gravity to it. So
right, yeah, otherwise they might not accept it. That's why it's important to have an understanding of the rules
Mhm.
before you get started, because you don't want to have to do extra work to work back around them.
And I always like if you can have somebody else read it before you submit things, like I write a lot for the blog at Give, and I wrote an article today and I was like, this just feels so technical. So I handed it off to somebody else. I'm like, tell me where it needs more like oomph, because right now it's just a technical how-to article and I want it to be a little more,
Mm.
have a little
Yeah,
more
or
personality.
I think a good tip here would be maybe find a blogging like accountability buddy where you could sort of
Yeah.
read each other's drafts. And it might even be something like a friend or spouse or somebody who's not in your industry, but who is like your friend and, wants to help you.
Yeah.
And trying to explain it to like the lay person, that'll probably help you to see if there's any like overly technical things or things that just don't make sense outside of the context that you have.
Yeah, for sure. And when it comes down to it, there are people that if you need to pay somebody, there are people who will proofread for hire, who will read for content for hire, things like that. Just be careful though, because if you go through Fiverr or something like that, you don't necessarily know what the qualifications are of that person.
Yep. Do some vetting.
Yep, absolutely. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Maddy. I really appreciate it. And make sure you
Absolutely.
follow Maddy on Twitter because she always posts some really good stuff.
Thanks.
For sure. We have about 15 minutes left. Maddy, you're welcome to stick around. If we usually have we wrap up with if anybody has any general questions, but I understand if you'd like to get to dinner too. So it's up to you.
All right. Yeah, I think I will peace out for now, but
Okay.
please, any follow-up questions, let me know. And it was a pleasure to speak with you all
Well, good
tonight.
to see you. I'm going to be messaging you about something else on Twitter, so I'll send that to you sometime tonight, probably.
I will look forward to it. All
Thank
right. Bye,
you.
everyone. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys.
Thank you for being
Thank
here.
you.